But again, a special thanks to First Alabama Bank for sponsoring this out of our past historical lecture series. And we're just really uh, so proud to have Matthew Downs with us today. Matthew came in last year and did a team on TVA, and he did such a good job. We all asked him back. We didn't know he was going to become famous, but he's dean of the College of Arts and Sciences and an associate professor of history at Mobile University. He is author of the Transforming the South, the Federal Development of the Tennessee Valley, and he's the co-editor of The American South and the Great War, and he's still writing, and I've already asked him to put us on the menu for next year, so be sure you remember that, Matthew. But he serves as editor of the Alabama Historical Review. It's a publication that's really important. He's vice president of the State Historical Association, so he has good connections. But the thing about it, what impressed all of us about him is that he is dynamic, he's educational, he's one of the most energetic people we know, and that energy transforms him into a great speaker. Matthew, we're just thrilled to have you, and we'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Streeter. Well, I don't know what to do with that introduction. Now the bar has been set very high, and you may not invite me back, so we'll see how it goes. Yeah, it's a real pleasure. I love coming up here. I've told Ted and Shirley, I think this is, and I tell other people this too, I think this is one of the best libraries, just period, that I've ever been in. And I love a library, so it's always fun to be at a place like this. So let's talk a little bit about World War I. Oh, let me go back. There we go. So we tend to forget about World War I in Alabama history. The Great War, as it is called at the time, is sandwiched between two really big wars, right? The Civil War on one side and World War II on the other. Everybody knows that these were two just transformational conflicts in Alabama history. And so the Great War, World War I, it just gets overshadowed. And I think that's a real shame. I think World War I did some things for Alabama to put Alabama on a path to modernity, to become the modern state it was. And so what I'd like for us to do today is to kind of look at some of those things, to think about how Alabama changed and its people changed during this period, and then to see if we can see hints of the modern state in that. Hopefully you all know something about World War I. I always tell my students, that's not for this class, that's for a different class. But hopefully you remember something about why the war started, right? We get a nationalist movement that sparks a political assassination in the Balkans that leads the Central Powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary, Ottoman Empire, to go to war against the Allied powers, France, England, Russia eventually. Russia will come out and become the Soviet Union. You will remember maybe that at the beginning, there was a very active war for about a month. We had 19th century style armies moving across battlefields. And then very quickly, we bogged down into trench warfare. A kind of warfare that was horrible, that was marked by disease and just bloody battles over very small pieces of land. This was the first major war to see the widespread use of airplanes and tanks and poison gas. Just unbelievably difficult fighting. One of the other things that made World War I so powerful, especially in Europe, but also a little bit in the United States, was it was the first total war, the first war that required nations involved to mobilize everything to win the war. This was a war that involved not just military action, but also political change, economic mobilization, social and cultural ramifications. And even though the United States was in World War I only for a brief period, you might remember that the U.S. declared war on Germany in April of 1917. This was, a little over 2 years after Europe had already been kind of bogged down in trenches. The end of the war is November 1918. American troops are really only in Europe for a matter of months. But even the United States was shaped by the war, and so Alabama was. And so that's what I want us to think a little bit about today. Alabamians, when the war broke out in August of 1914, Alabamians paid attention. They read their newspapers. The Montgomery Advertiser said that the World War I, the Great War, was, quote, the chief subject of conversation throughout the city. Most Alabamians, like most Americans at the time, wanted the U.S. to be neutral. They believed that the best approach for the United States was to stay out. And in this, Alabamians looked to President Woodrow Wilson, who himself pushed for neutrality at the beginning. Wilson was the first Southern president since the Civil War. Many Alabamians, like other Southerners, identified with him, saw him as this kind of reemergence of the South onto the national stage. The Birmingham News praised President Wilson in August 1914 for, quote, protecting American interests at home and abroad. They also pointed out that they were very glad the U.S. was neutral because it would allow the economy to, quote, go on just as freely and smoothly as it ever has. This was one of the big concerns for Alabamians in staying neutral. Can we continue to operate like we have? And maybe even with Europe distracted over here with all this fighting, maybe there might even be a benefit for us. And it's that idea, this idea that maybe neutrality was the best policy, that led Alabama to feel the first impact of the war, a conflict over the export of Alabama's chief agricultural staple that we call the cotton crisis. The problem stemmed from the fact that early on in the war, Great Britain defeated Germany's surface navy, enforced a blockade of Europe, and then began to control the kinds of goods that could come for the rest of the world into Europe, and specifically to Germany. England had a list, they called it the contraband list, and it listed all of the goods that they would not allow Germany to have, that they would intercept before they could come into Europe. At first, cotton was not on that list, but Alabamians were nervous. Cotton was the chief agricultural export from Alabama. Alabamians understood that the ability to get cotton to other parts of the world was essential. They believed that part of the strength of neutrality was that no one could tell them not to send cotton to someone. And most Alabamians would have argued with you and said, cotton is not a wartime good. What are you going to do? Hit somebody with cotton? Cotton is neutral. But they started getting word. Every once in a while, Britain would take the cotton. They would intercept ships with cotton on them. And this was really problematic because Alabama in 1914 was having a good cotton year. The 1914 crop was the largest cotton crop on record. 60% of that crop was destined for export. And it wasn't just that they were afraid that Britain would take the cotton. Alabama, or the United States, did not have much of a merchant marine in the early 1900s. Most of our things that we sent to Europe, we sent on British ships. And so not only is Britain perhaps threatening to take our cotton, we also need British ships to bring it. And many of them were tied up in the war. They were, especially as Germany began submarine warfare, that was a much more dangerous prospect. And so Alabama farmers got nervous. And when they got nervous, they started doing something that was relatively new for them. They appealed to the federal government because now the guy in charge of that government was a Southerner and might listen to them and might listen to their concerns. The editor of the Progressive Farmer, a guy named Clarence Poe, told Senator John Bankhead, what are you going to do for the man at the bottom? Get in there and tell this guy to help us out. They wanted Wilson to make Britain let cotton through. They told Wilson, maybe you should kind of artificially raise the price of cotton. So imagine their frustration when Wilson did not. This was the kind of request, kind of asking the government to step in the economy, that Wilson and a lot of other government officials were not willing to do. It was too far. This is before the New Deal. These sorts of things had not really been done. Wilson did agree to kind of enter negotiations with Britain to try to make sure that they would let cotton through. Wilson also really encouraged the building of a merchant marine, American ships to take goods overseas, and we'll see the effects of that in a second. But he wouldn't raise the price of cotton artificially, and he wouldn't be too aggressive with Britain in trying to force them to do something. Britain, as we know, was fairly sympathetic to them. It led to some great quotes in some of the letters these farmers wrote to Wilson. Let me give you one example. This is what one farmer, a man named L.J. McConnell, wrote about Wilson. He said Wilson was, quote, a psalm-singing, Pecksniffian, damned hypocrite in his professions of friendship for the farmer. That Pecksniffian, that gets me every time. I have no clue what it means. But I don't think it's good. That's not a good word. There was a silver lining, though. In 1915, Britain decided cotton had to be contraband. They pointed out that cotton was made into uniforms, it was made into wadding for ammunition. Cotton could be considered a wartime thing. In Germany, the war was still going on. People are bogged down in trenches. Britain had to be more aggressive. But in order to maintain good relations with the United States, in order to keep Wilson on his side, Britain said, tell you what, we're not going to give your cotton to Germany, but we'll buy all of it. We'll buy every bit of it, we'll just keep buying it. We'll artificially inflate the cotton to keep you happy. By the end of 1915, the Birmingham Age Herald promised that the outlook for the Cotton Belt was, quote, even brighter than the most optimistic forecasts. The cotton crisis, I think, reinforced two lessons that Southerners needed to learn in the early 20th century. The first, and we'll mention this one again in a second, is that cotton was a very fragile economic foundation for Alabama. If that's your one thing, global conflict can give you trouble with it. The second thing is that in challenging times, the South could use its political power to try to pressure the government to change. We'll see that again with the New Deal. We'll see it into the World War II era with the attraction of defense plants. Southerners were learning lessons about how the modern world worked. But that first lesson, the idea that there needed to be some sort of economic alternative, was got a boost during World War I, too. Because different kinds of economic alternatives began to emerge. There are two really good examples of this. The first was way up in the north, near Muscle Shoals, which is over near Florence. The government was looking for some sort of domestic production of nitrates. Nitrates, this fundamental product to be used in munitions. The U.S. imported a lot of its nitrates. They were worried that with the war, those imports might dry up. And so President Wilson signed a bill that would put government investment into a production facility for nitrates somewhere in the U.S. This is like today when an automobile manufacturer says, we'd like to open a plant in the United States. There was this immediate scramble among every community you can think of to get that plant. But Alabama had powerful politicians, John Bankhead, Tom Heflin. And so in June of 1916, Wilson signed the legislation. Soon after that, it was announced that the government had chosen a site at Muscle Shoals, this very shallow part of the Tennessee River that boats could not go over, where the government had long been interested in finding a navigational aid. The government planned for 2 nitrate plants and, to power them, a hydroelectric dam that would also have the benefit of backing the water up over the shoals and letting boats come through. Alabamians, particularly North Alabamians, were overjoyed. Nitrate plants, which would put people to work. If you were struggling in the cotton fields, you had a job, either building the plants, operating them, building the dam. The dam would create electricity, and it was always promised that it would create more electricity than the plants needed, so maybe you could get some. And you could get some relatively inexpensive because the dam would already be there. But then they thought, no, and then more businesses will want to come locate here. Pretty soon, there was a real estate boom in and around Florence with people flooding in to take advantage of this opportunity, to the point that subdivisions began popping up before people even lived in them. There are still places in North Alabama today where there are street cuts and curb cuts and no houses in the midst of fields from this boom a century ago. Farmers are also excited. Nitrates, when not used for munitions, are also pretty valuable as fertilizer. And if you're a cotton farmer and you're thinking about increased production, the idea that after the war those nitrate plants might make fertilizer would have also made you very happy. Unfortunately for Muscle Shoals, the war ended too quickly. The nitrate plants had just finished construction by 1918 when the war effort scaled down. One of the plants had just come online. The other plant, the processes they used to make nitrates didn't even really work. The dam had not been completed by the time the war ended. And the incoming Republican administration of Warren Harding slashed government spending, which cut the funds for the plants. They did eventually complete the dam, which was named after the president who signed the legislation to put it into effect, Wilson Dam. And the plants languished until the advent of the New Deal, and we'll say something about that in a second. The second place that benefited from economic development during the war was Mobile. Of course, in Mobile, the focus was on the port. The port of Mobile was a cotton port. Cotton moved through it. The wealth of Mobile was based on shipping cotton through. Of course, the cotton crisis scared the port of Mobile. The lack of British merchant ships coming back and forth for the cotton was problematic for Mobile. Mobile had an even other problem. Just before World War I, New Orleans had updated its port facilities. And so many shippers would have just rather taken their cotton over to New Orleans and went through that port. In fact, there were even efforts to build railroads connecting Mobile to New Orleans so that if you were a cotton producer, you could just bypass Mobile altogether. Mobilians were terrified. One Mobilian, the attorney Frederick Bromberg, noted as late as 1916 that the docks are empty weekdays as well as Sundays, and that everybody was, quote unquote, economizing. But then Wilson stepped in again. Wilson authorized American shipbuilding contracts. He also encouraged that building of an American merchant marine. This was a life raft for Mobile. Businessmen began investing into shipways at the dock. The most famous, of course, was the Alabama Dry Dock and Shipping Company, or ADSCO, which opened in the summer of 1917. ADSCO built ships, minesweepers, barges. They also took on repair contracts. Later that same year, George Gordon Crawford, who was the president of Birmingham's Tennessee Coal, Iron and Railroad, TCI, announced that he was going to build a shipbuilding factory at Chickasaw. Chickasaw became a planned community just north of Mobile. 5,000 workers showed up. They built a set of housing, and you can still drive through kind of the residential area of Chickasaw and see a lot of those shipbuilding workers' houses. 14 shipways. Other companies followed suit, came into Mobile, began working on some of these contracts. The editor of the Mobile Register said that, quote, "The heavens opened and the war which threatened to extinguish Mobile was shown to be an immense advantage." But again, the war ended too soon. Only less than a year after operation at ADSCO, and even just a few months after Chickasaw, the war was over. British ships started coming back, and British ships, which had these established shipping routes, started taking back over cotton. Americans kept some of those routes, but not as much. Through the 1920s and 1930s, ADSCO and Chickasaw limped along. The one bright spot was that Alabama's leaders in Montgomery realized that Mobile and Alabama could succeed if they upgraded their port as well. And so the end of World War I, this last few months, and then into the early 1920s, there was a concerted effort to build a state docks. These state docks in Mobile came out of this era, and this idea that Alabama has to compete with New Orleans, it has to provide an outlet for its goods. It would be easy for us to look at Muscle Shoals and Mobile and say, this is little, right? They didn't really last. Muscle Shoals kind of went into decline. Mobile struggled along. But it's important to see these as foundational. Muscle Shoals became the seed for TVA. And TVA took the ideas of Muscle Shoals, cheap power, industrial development, and remade the northern part of the state, and then much of the other parts of the Tennessee Valley as well. At Mobile, the ideas that came out of World War I, that we should invest in the port, that we focus on the strengths and we encourage American and Alabama shipping, became the state docks. And then in World War II, ADSCO and Chickasaw, these shipbuilding plants exploded. One of the reasons why Mobile is a major American city is because it built on the foundation of those events in World War I. Now, Muscle Shoals and Mobile they're outliers. They're industrial facilities that brought out a development. Most Alabama communities, when they thought about World War I, they didn't think about a factory or a shipyard. They thought about military camps. Because this too was a kind of economic development. It was a way to bring a lot of people to where you live, to train young men to bring their families. It was also patriotic. If you were in Alabama and you wanted to show your support for the war, supporting young men going off to fight was a way to do it. Cities across the state pushed for military camps, but two in particular won out. One was Anniston, and the second was Montgomery, so we'll talk about both of them. In early 1917, the Army purchased land about a mile from Anniston. They initially planned an artillery range, but then when the war broke out and it was clear that there were going to be troops sent over when America entered the war, and we knew we were going to send some young men over to fight, the site became a large divisional training camp. It was named for a Union general, George McClellan. It hosted the 29th Blue-Gray Infantry Division, which was pulled from the Atlantic seaboard. Now, surely locals did not like the fact that a Yankee had taken the name of their camp. They didn't like the fact that some of that 29th Blue-Gray Division were Yankees themselves. But any anger that came out of that very quickly subsided when it became clear that that camp created jobs, including construction jobs for African Americans in and around Anniston who would have had trouble otherwise finding well-paying work. McClellan also hosted black companies from Maryland and Ohio, and as we'll see in a second, African American families in the Anniston area were essential in helping those people, helping the black companies who show up find kind of family and connection. Of course, you know that when the war ended, McClellan remained U.S. Army property. Those tents that you can see were replaced with wooden barracks. The sewer system was improved, and in 1929, it became Fort McClellan. More fortunate than Anniston, though, was Montgomery. A lot of these camps were the result of very well-placed politicians. By the time we get to World War I, the Democratic Party in the South had become the only viable party. And so in election after election, Alabama Democrats got reelected. They became long-standing members of Congress. As they did so, they began to move in these really essential committees. John Bankhead had made it onto the Rivers and Harbors Committee. That's why he was able to kind of direct a hydroelectric dam to the Tennessee River. He was in the right place. Montgomery had Representative Stanley Dent Jr., who by 1917 was the chair of the House Committee on Military Affairs. When it came up that we needed a training camp, he was extremely well placed. In 1917, the government announced that it would take control of Vandiver Park, which had been used as a mobilization camp for Alabama National Guardsmen, and it would form Camp Sheridan, again named after a Union military officer. We're not sure exactly why the government liked naming things after Union military officers. I'm sure that Southerners thought it was a direct assault on them, but I'm not sure. The Montgomery Advertiser was ecstatic. They promised that, quote, immense sums would be spent there. Camp Sheridan hosted the 37th Buckeye Division, 30,000 troops, mostly white, but not exclusively white troops from Ohio. When the Buckeye Division showed up and they brought people with them, they overnight more than doubled the population of Montgomery, which, as you can imagine, if you were a business owner thinking about selling stuff to those people, you would have been ecstatic. The most famous inhabitant of Camp Sheridan came a little later. After the 37th shipped for Europe, the 9th Infantry showed up. Among them was that young man right there. That is 2nd Lieutenant F. Scott Fitzgerald. Fitzgerald was an infantry platoon leader who, when he arrived in Montgomery, became enamored with a young lady named Zelda Sayer, who was from one of the more prominent families in Montgomery. He went off for a brief tour of France. He kept Zelda on his mind. When he returned back from France, he swept her up out into the Roaring Twenties. Many of you know F. Scott and Zelda Fitzgerald as, of course, this our very famous American 1920s writer, but also kind of the poster children of the flapper generation. A love affair that began right next door. Dent was not done. In November, he informed Montgomery that the Army had selected a second site in the city, an Army flight training field near the Pike Road area called Taylor Field. There, air cadets completed flight training, mechanical instruction, military preparation. These were young men who would go overseas and serve in pursuit squads, bomber squads, observation squads. It was pretty common to use planes to fly over enemy trenches and look down in them to where people were. Dent was not done. Dent then informed Montgomery a third site had been chosen for a government facility. This one, the government had chosen a field. Oh, let me go back one. I don't have a picture of that one, I guess. A field that had a really interesting history in Montgomery. It was a field that had been run as a civilian flight training school by the Wright brothers, who had come to Montgomery because Dayton, Ohio was very cold in the winter, and Montgomery had basically said, if you'll come down here, we'll give you whatever you want. So the Wright brothers had a school in Montgomery. That was kind of defunct by the time World War I came around, but the government took it over. It was called Wright's Field, but the technical name was Repair Depot Number 3. It hosted about 1,400 soldiers, mechanics, carpenters, pilots. That boring name, Repair Depot Number 3, belies that it's probably the most important of these, because it was the only facility in Montgomery to survive kind of decommissioning, demobilization after World War I. It became home to Maxwell Air Force Base and Air University. At both Camp Sheridan and Camp McClellan, the goal was to prepare troops for combat. At McClellan, for instance, the division commander there went over to France, watched warfare occur. What do the trenches look like? How are they set up? What do our troops, what are they expected to do? Then he came back to Camp McClellan and put it in action. African-American construction crews dug a network of trenches at McClellan. They set up posts in barbed wire. And then the young men at McClellan were trained to go over the top. They were trained to run through barbed wire, to cross over into no man's land. They even practiced kind of throwing on their gas masks and going into this dangerous area. At Camp Sheridan, officials brought in guest lecturers. They brought in British commanders and French commanders and had them explain to the troops, this is what you will see. This is what you should know. There are great pictures of them learning to use bayonets with the idea that you will be in hand-to-hand combat, you should be ready for it. Of course, these military camps also had a seamier side. Officials, as concerned as they were about encouraging the young men to learn to fight and to learn good discipline and order, they were also afraid of some of the temptations that came along with military camps. In fact, at Sheridan, the commander, Brigadier General Steiner, complained that there were two evils assaulting his camp, not Germans, liquor and sinful activities. We'll make it PG. Liquor was already this huge discussion of concern in Alabama, right? This is about 10 years after Alabama had enacted statewide prohibition. But as you could probably guess, young men at camp knew how to get liquor. They knew where to find it. There were plenty of people in Montgomery willing to help them to do so. The fears of young men getting access to liquor was not only part of the discussions about prohibition in Alabama, this discussion during World War I fed into ideas about nationwide prohibition as well. That second concern was even more troubling. Officials routinely noted that young men left camp, talked to very willing taxi drivers in Anniston and Montgomery who took them wherever they wanted to go, including to what were called houses of ill repute. Montgomery had to scramble to address this. Montgomery created detention centers for people who staffed houses of ill repute. They created a home for wayward young women as an idea of kind of prevention. They also had to dedicate entire days to just prosecuting vice. There were so many court cases with young men involved in these sorts of things that they couldn't just allow them to go into the normal court docket. They had to have special days where they just heard those cases. But the real concern came towards the end of the conflict when Alabama, like the rest of the country, was hit with the Spanish flu. This very contagious form of influenza, which had arrived in America with troops coming back from Western Europe. These are young men who live in military camps. They are not clean. They are not sanitary. They don't worry about disease transmission like we might think so in the modern world. And so the Spanish flu ran rampant in parts of Alabama. The historian Wayne Flint, many of you know Wayne Flint, he wrote that in Alabama, quote, the virus spread like wildfire. Many camps had to set up special hospital barracks. They had to set up special isolation units to try to keep young men apart, but it was overwhelming. In total, about 5,000 National Guardsmen, 7,000 volunteers, about 70,000 draftees served in World War I from Alabama. Of those, about 2,500 were killed in the fighting. Some of them were draftees. About a month after the declaration of war, Woodrow Wilson signed the Selective Service Act. Young men registered for the draft and then could be called up. If you were called up, you went before a draft board who would judge your fitness for service. The government made sure that draft boards were local. They believed that if a local draft board would be better able to determine whether the person standing before them had the responsibilities they claimed. If you said, no, I'm a family man and I've got a wife and kids and I take care of them, the local board might know, oh, that guy's single, he's lying to get out of fighting, we'll get that guy in. We know that draft boards brought in, they inducted about half of the registrants called before them. About 60% of those draftees in Alabama were white, about 40% were black. Once they were into the service, they were sprinkled in with existing National Guard units, which we'll talk about next. The core units that we think of when we think of Alabama fighting in World War I came out of those National Guard units. The Alabama National Guard had been busy before World War I. In 1916 and early 1917, the young men of the National Guard had been sent out west. This was an age in which Pancho Villa was raiding across the Mexican border. And so Alabama's young men had been sent over to kind of do border duty. When they came back in early 1917, many of them thought, oh boy, I'm going to get mustered out. I have done my service out west in Texas and New Mexico. When I come home, it will be peacetime. Instead, they found that the U.S. had declared war on Germany, that the guards had been ordered to maximum strength. They were to begin training and prepare for war. The Guard recruited heavily across the state. If you decided to volunteer, or if you were drafted, you received a medical examination to ensure you were fit for duty. These medical examinations are one of the greatest tools historians have to understand health in Alabama during this period. We know that fully 1/4 of the young men who underwent these medical examinations were rejected. They were underweight. They had heart disease. They had venereal disease. Many of them had bad teeth to the point that you can't serve. If you have bad teeth and can't serve, that's a problem. In fact, these high rates of medical rejection encouraged health reforms in Alabama after World War I. To treat things like pellagra and hookworm that had been proven to be rampant, thanks largely to what we found out during World War I. In August of 1917, the State Guard, which had kind of risen up to 5,000 young men, entered federal service. The Guard's 4th Infantry, under War Department orders, became the 167th Infantry, part of the 42nd Division. This was a division that included men from 20 different states that earned them their nickname, the Rainbow Division. You've probably heard of them. The rest of Alabama's guardsmen joined units from Georgia and Florida. They became the 31st Division, or the Dixie Division. The 31st spent most of its time in Georgia training. They did ship out to France, but that was at the end of the war. Much of their duty was kind of mopping up guard duty. But the Rainbow Division had a storied career in Europe. Alabama's 167th first landed at Camp Mills on Long Island. Then they shipped out to Liverpool and then to Le Havre in France. In February of 1918, the 167th entered the trenches. They were on the front lines in World War I from February of 1918 till the end of the war, about 9 months. When we think about Alabama young men who served and who experienced World War I, we think of the 167th. They were in the trenches. They went through the barbed wire. They came under artillery shelling. They fought at major battles, the Meuse-Argonne, Saint Mihiel, the Second Battle of the Marne. But the most famous battle that the 167th were involved in was at a place called Croix Rouge Farm. Croix Rouge was a fortified compound where the Rainbow Division had been ordered to reverse a German bulge at a place called Chateau Thierry. The German bulge had pushed in on French lines. It was angling towards Paris. The 167th were sent in to replace another division. They were told, look, the Germans are falling back. They're in a state of retreat. This is going to be easy. Don't worry about it. The 167th showed up. They got in those foxholes that had been just hastily dug and left behind by the troops they replaced. They found instead that the Germans were well dug in. They had set up interlocking fields of machine gun fire. They were ready to defend this farmhouse. The U.S. sent out some strong patrols and faced heavy casualties. Nevertheless, these young men were ordered over the top. An advance on this well-guarded farmhouse in broad daylight, just an impossible task. Two assault battalions drove out. They faced heavy casualties. A third one found itself in intense hand-to-hand combat with German troops. Reports tell us that they gave the rebel yell as they were fighting, which maybe they did. We always like to tell that story for sure. The engagement cost 162 dead, many more injured, but at least 283 Germans were killed, and the Alabamians took the farmhouse. The commander of the 42nd said that the Rainbow Division, quote, proved itself to be a first-class division in every sense, swift in attack and tenacious in attack and defense. In 2011, a monument to the Alabamians was erected at Croix Rouge, so if you go over there and you'd like to see a monument to those brave Alabama soldiers, there it is. You can see it. We noted there were some black regiments stationed in Alabama. The Maryland and the Ohio were northern units who were stationed in the South. They were training before they joined French command. If we want to think about black Alabamians who served, we have to think about expatriates, Alabamians who had left the South and joined up in other places and then served. The best example of those is this man right here, James Reese Europe. Europe had moved with his family to Washington, D.C. from Mobile before the war. He trained as a musician. He found himself in New York City, where he was an active musician. He composed songs. He directed musical groups and orchestras. In 1916, he formed a band for a New York Guard regiment. When the war broke out, that regiment became the 369th Harlem Hellfighters. Europe maintained his position as the band director and became an officer of a machine gun company. The Hellfighters were fierce fighters, as their name implies, but they were more important perhaps because when the war ended, the band hung around and traveled around Europe, bringing this new American style of music. James Reese Europe, by many historians, is credited with bringing jazz to Europe because of this band he brought with him and the style of music he played. Most African Americans, though, did not serve in combat units. There was great prejudice during the World War I era with the idea that African Americans could not train to fight, and if trained, could only serve in labor and support units. 660 black Alabamians were killed in military combat, though, mostly from disease. There's only about 22 combat deaths. But military service was revolutionary for black Alabamians. Black leaders had encouraged African Americans to join the war effort. Booker T. Washington's successor at Tuskegee, who was Robert Russa-Moton, told a group of black farmers in Prattville in April 1917 that they should, quote, contribute everything possible to the aid and support of the country. Many African Americans believed that service in the war would result in equality later, that it would bring about real gains. Unfortunately, that wasn't true. In fact, segregation remained, and there were many instances of violence against black veterans who returned back home. We can't finish talking about the experience of African Americans, though, without talking about the experience for many Black Alabamians during the war, which was to leave Alabama. World War I began a great demographic shift in the United States called the Great Migration. African Americans left Alabama, and they left Alabama largely for two reasons. The first was that with the outbreak of war, all of a sudden there were all of these economic opportunities up north as defense plants and other industries began to replace workers that were leaving overseas to fight. Many of those industries sent recruiters into the South looking for workers, hoping that African Americans trapped in kind of debt cycles in the South would want to make real money. But the second draw was freedom. The idea that even though there was discrimination in the North, that discrimination was more customary than legal, that the violence was not as directed. And so those opportunities, economic and social, drew Black Alabamians out. Historians think that between 1917 and 1918, about 100,000 Black Alabamians left for the North. Many of them got on trains. They got on trains individually, as family, in some cases big groups from communities, and they relocated to Chicago, to Detroit. There were whole neighborhoods in Chicago and Detroit and Cleveland that could trace their roots to Alabama. Many famous Black Alabamians came out of that migration, probably the most famous being Jesse Owens, the great Olympian who left Lawrence County right after World War I for Ohio. For most Alabamians, though, the war was experienced at home. And the war brought about real patriotism. And this is another one of those important gains that we see in the war. Alabamians felt patriotic. For the first time in 1918, the state legislature authorized the flying of the American flag over the Alabama state capitol as an expression of wartime solidarity. Patriotic rallies were a common occurrence. Music, speeches given by 4-minute men and women who had trained to give these kind of patriotic addresses, Liberty Bond drives, volunteer opportunities. In fact, volunteer opportunities were one of the key ways that women got involved in Alabama. After the Progressive Era, many women had begun entering into voluntary service, taking leadership role in community organizations. The war was a perfect opportunity for this. Women joined the Red Cross and sewed bandages. They were drivers. They hosted young men who were at these military camps so that they could have a good home-cooked meal. Women served in the YWCA. Women served in the Women's Committee of the Council of Defense. Many women used these wartime experiences to argue for the right to vote. In fact, the idea that women's suffrage was a viable political option came out of World War I, even if Alabama failed to ratify it. It still passed anyway. On November 11th, 1918, at 11 o'clock, an armistice went into effect in Europe. It marked a cessation of fighting, an Allied victory. There were celebrations all over Alabama. Some of them were spontaneous. Let me give you an example here. In Talladega, the spontation was, and I will quote the newspaper, the Mountain Home, quote, a general jollification meeting where the people came together and gave expression to their happiness. It sounded like an ad hoc parade. If you had done anything for the war or were just excited about it, you came out and marched. Somebody who had a hearse, I guess the local funeral director, seems to have put a sign on the hearse that said, quote, Kaiser Bill on his way to hell, the fumes of sulfur he soon will smell. Well, that's good poetry. The most famous of the celebrations, of course, came in Montgomery as the 167th returned from Europe. You can see it here. The locals built their own kind of ad hoc arch. You can see it here, Our Heroes Victory. You can't see it at the top. There was a recreation of Lady Liberty. The 167th marched down Commerce Street under the arch to cheering crowds. A lot of things stayed the same in Alabama, or at least seemed to. Alabama was still an agricultural state. The little hints of industry we talked about were new. They were barely growing. There was still segregation. Women had earned the right to vote, but for many women, that was kind of the plateau of political power. It would be easy for us to point to a lot of that and claim that nothing changed, that World War I is a blip, that we've got to look elsewhere for importance. But I think we should look at those little seeds of change. I think we should look at the way that Alabamians became patriotic. This is 50 years after the Civil War. For Alabamians to wave American flags, to agree to fly the American flag over the state capitol, to join the United States Army, it suggested that something had changed. The fact that Alabamians were beginning to look to the government for help, the cotton crisis, the bringing in camps and bringing in facilities, that there were these new hints of a new economy in Mobile and Muscle Shoals, that African American men and women had seen something different and were asking for change, that women had participated in public life and had seen something different. If we look at World War I, there are these hints of a modern Alabama and this foundation that we will see Alabama build on for the next war. Now, I don't want for us to finish without talking just a second about memorials. How did Alabama remember the war? And so I want to talk about kind of two memorials that help us think about the war. Just a few months after the armistice, the state of Alabama created a memorial commission. Its job was to find an idea, use some state money, and build a memorial to Alabama service. The result took a little bit of time. It wasn't completed until 1940. But the result was the World War Memorial Building in Montgomery. If you have ever been to the state archives to do research, you have been in the World War Memorial Building. It now has two wings on the side. The little White House of the Confederacy is up here in the front. That portico faces out towards the Capitol building. That building is a World War I memorial to the troops who served and the people who served. Most communities found ways to remember the war. Anniston, Eufaula, Wedowee, they all have doughboy statues, right? Statues of young men who fought. Florence and Tuscaloosa, they have artillery pieces, right? They have artillery that is either replicas or some model of a kind used in the war. Most places that don't have those have some sort of plaque recognizing the young men who served. The second largest memorial in the state of Alabama, though, is in Mobile. Built in 1926 with money raised by the Mothers Army and Navy League, the Soldiers and Sailors Memorial was designed by local architects with marble from Sylacauga. It was located in Memorial Park, this very small wedge of city property where government and airport diverge. It's kind of like a triangle. There's a very famous cannon there that gets painted by the winning football team in a local rivalry. So that's how most people know it. At its dedication, the memorial had a plaque with the names of 63 Mobilians who died during the war. But it was very quickly clear that that was incomplete. The plaque only counted white Mobilians who died in the war. In 2023, this is like a century after it was built, the city rectified that mistake, adding the names of 53 black Mobilians who died in service. The historian who oversaw the project for the city, Jacob Lawrence, said that until this discussion about updating the plaque, most people who drove past this didn't see it, there's some trees in the way, or, quote, cannot tell you what it's even about. And that's true. It looks like just a weird park building. But once people talked about it, and once we talked about those plaques, people remembered. And it caused this new discussion about the war. And I think this should be a larger project for us, that we should remember Alabama's experience during the Great War and to think about the ways that our communities, our modern Alabama, was shaped in that process. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Dr. Downs, do you want to take a few questions?
I'll take questions.
Does anybody have a question they would like to ask? Comments, questions? Okay, if not, I just want to say, I mention this as frequently as I can, but it's so refreshing, especially in the day of Google and the internet and searching. When you know, like I do, you type in a subject you want to read about, you read an article, you have no idea whether it's valid, whether it's researched, you have no idea about the validity of what you're reading. So it's always so nice to me to have somebody that has researched and knows their subject, and they've put so much into presenting this program. So I want to thank you again so much for coming, Dr. Downs, and traveling so far.
Oh, I know.
To
I'm
present
so.
such a great program.
I always tell people I'll talk about history to anybody. This is not a problem. Yeah.
So thank you. And thank you all so much for coming today. I want to also thank the bank, Mr. Chris. The First Bank of Alabama is wonderful. Miss Jane for coming and helping give out those wonderful cookies from the Hickory Street Cafe. I want to mention Dr. Shirley Spears in the back of the room, because I just want to always make sure that you know that we get people the caliber of Dr. Downs, because they value Dr. Spears when she calls them and invites them to come. So thank you, Dr. Spears, for the great work that you continue to do through the Library Foundation. I also want to mention, for the last few weeks, we've had he's not a guest, he's a welcome member of the audience, but I want to mention our mayor. Mayor Heigl has such a good, he always comes out, he supports, and it's always good to see you, Mayor. Thank you. Now, next week, Miss Ruth Cook will be here. You've all seen Ruth. You know Ruth. Ruth did a wonderful job researching Sylacauga marble. She has written the history of Sylacauga marble. If you have not read that book, we do have those for sale, but it is a fantastic read. As well as being informative. And you just mentioned Sylacauga marble, so thank you for the plug on that. So next week, Miss Ruth will be here, and she's going to do a fun program. She's going to talk about some of the superstitions and some of the things that we do that we don't even realize we do. If you X your windshield when a black cat crosses in front, or you won't walk under a ladder, or whatever those things are that you do, she's going to have a fun program next week. Thank you all for coming today. We would not have a program without you. So thank you for being here, and we will see you next week.